Good afternoon, everyone, and a very happy, should I say, a happy Thursday lunchtime to everyone. It's great that you're all here with us today. We're really excited because today we're joined by Dr. Linda Parker, who's going to be talking to us all about the Army chaplains in the First World War, which is a really interesting topic. So I hope you all enjoy today's lecture. As is always the case, these lectures are completely free of charge. So if you see anybody commenting away saying that you could watch it elsewhere, please don't click those links. But the first 10 minutes of these lectures we always dedicate to something called Church of the Week, which is where we explore one of the 356 historic churches in the care of the Churches Conservation Trust, which has a link or a connection in some way with today's topic. Normally that's given by our Chief Executive, Peter Ayres, but he's got a prior engagement today. So it falls to my line manager, Shana James, who will be talking to you all about this week's Church of the Week. So without any further delay, I'm going to pass you over to Shana.
Thank you, George. You almost gave it away then, didn't you, before I had a chance to introduce it. I'm now going to share my screen. So just bear with me 1 second to get the PowerPoint up. So, George, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Great. Sorry, my laptop's been very slow today. So, first I'd like to thank Ecclesiastical Insurance for sponsoring Church of the Week and of their support of the lunchtime lectures. Today's Church of the Week, it's close to the fine city of Norwich. It's a small village called Brandeston in Norfolk. It's dedicated to St. Nicholas and is one of 131 round tower churches in Norfolk. The tower, which stands at the northwest corner of the church, was almost completely rebuilt in 1890 after being damaged in a gale. The lower part of the tower is round, the octagonal top part being a later modification. There was nothing in the tower to indicate an original date earlier than the 12th century, until repairs in 1996 revealed that a crack was in fact the southwest corner of the original Norman nave. Although only 10 miles from Norwich, Brandeston Church has a very remote and rural setting. The place name Brandeston is thought to mean homestead or village belonging to a person named Brant. St. Nicholas is built mostly of flint with a pan-tiled roof. It has an unusual plan. The tower stands at the west end of the north aisle. The aisle was originally the nave, its chancel having been demolished in the 18th century. The porch was presumably built around the same time as the present nave, but has subsequently been replaced, as you can see here. So been repaired, particularly the gable, which is largely constructed of brick and flint. The gable has a niche containing a small statue of the patron saint carved in 1938. The rebuilding of the nave was carried out in about 1400. The window tracery you can see here on the south side is particularly interesting. The three-light window has a decorated motif based on the four-petaled flower, whilst the flanking ones are perpendicular tracery with eyelets heading the supermullions just below the arch. The church has a light and attractive interior owing to the lack of stained glass, and much of the plain glass here we think is pre-1800, judging to the unevenness of the individual panes. The roof, which was plastered over in the nave, is probably 18th century at the earliest, and 19th century at the east end. The other furnishings are likewise relatively modern, but are generally well designed. The organ brought here from nearby Haveringland Hall is a small chamber instrument with 4 stops. You can just see in the corner of this picture. It's a painted deal case in the late 17th century style, but is probably of early 19th century date. A barrel, apparently from a different organ, is kept in the vestry. The font here has a contemporary oak cover topped with a wrought-iron finial. The font it supplanted an early one, probably 12th or 13th century. And on the wall of the north aisle is his poignant memorial to 2 sons of the rector of Brandeston, Basil Enright, during the First World War. Anthony is buried in Etaples Military Cemetery, France. Preston has no known grave. He's remembered on the Doré Memorial in Greece. As you can see, Preston died in action just 1 week before the armistice was announced. These two sons of the rector appear to be the only two men from Brandeston who died during action during the war. Across Norfolk, 15,000 men were killed fighting. And finally, the oak reredos in the chancel was given as a thank offering by the Mee family in 1919. The panelling is done in simple arts and crafts style, as the Gothic style was unfashionable at this point, and it bears the text, Benedictus qui veni in nomine Domini, which translates as, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And that, everyone, is Church of the Week, Brandeston in Norfolk, and I'll now hand back over to George.
Thank you so much, Shana. And I think, yeah, that was a very poignant Church of the Week today, particularly with that quite poignant war memorial on the North Nave Wall to the two sons of the rector who died. And very sadly, that he died, the youngest died just 1 week before the armistice was announced. A warm welcome, everyone, to those of you who are joining us today, especially if you're joining us for the first time. That was Church of the Week, which, as Shana said, was the Church of St. Nicholas in Brandeston in Norfolk. Shana, so we've got a couple of questions, or a couple of time, or a bit of time, should I say, for a couple of questions about some work. And I think one of the things that I know that some people may not know that, but at the Church Conservation Trust, some of our churches are used on the silver screen, aren't they? And can you tell us a bit about some of the work and sort of maybe some of the films that our churches have appeared in?
Yeah, well, we had some filming recently, but I can't talk about that because it's embargoed until next year. But I won't say any more about that. But in the past, so one I can talk about is Mary, Queen of Scots, the feature film starring Saoirse Ronan and Margot Robbie. I actually saw that recently again, and it's a really great film. And that was filmed in Albury, St Peter and Paul, Albury in Surrey. Near Guildford, and it was really exciting. That was used for the scenes with John Knox. It was supposedly a church in the city centre of Edinburgh, so that was really exciting. And of course, film location work brings in much needed income to the Churches Conservation Trust, and that goes towards conserving churches. But that church has also been used for the Scottish wedding in Four Weddings and a Funeral. So two completely unrelated Scottish sort of links to films. That was back in 1994. So it has been in other ones, but those are the two of my favourite ones for that church.
Thanks, Sean. I remember when I joined the Trust, I was reading about filming, and I'm a huge Jane Austen fan. And I remember Googling and reading about filming, and I thought it said Pride and Prejudice, but it wasn't. It was Pride, Prejudice and Zombies was the film that one of our churches was used in. But as you said there, it's we've done classical stuff, we've done modern stuff. But as I said, it is quite important, isn't it, as an income stream for the Trust, isn't it, Shana?
Of course, and now there's a lot more filming going on in this country, particularly with Netflix taking off, and we still have things like we had Gentleman Jack, BBC things. We've had Poldark in one of our West churches. So yes, with any film location managers out there, our church, we have 356 churches across the country, and yeah, they can be used for, and it's 1,000 years of history, so they can lend themselves to a wide range of historical and contemporary film locations.
Thanks, Shana. So if any of you got any questions about filming our church, do comment away and let us know. If you know any films that our church has been in, again, comment away and let us know what you thought of them. But particularly the one there Shana said about Mary, Queen of Scots is a really interesting a film. And if you haven't seen it, I do highly recommend you watch it. So everyone, welcome to today's lunchtime lecture. If you're joining us for the first time, let us know. But everyone, let us know where you're joining us from. I'm joined with my two dogs, as you can probably see, jumping around and playing behind me. But yeah, I'm based here in North London, so it's great to be talking to you no matter where you are watching us from. As always, these lectures are completely free of charge to watch and enjoy. So if you see anyone commenting away, letting you know that you can watch it elsewhere, please don't click those links. You can only watch them live on our Facebook page. These lectures are recorded and you can catch up on those on our YouTube channel, but also on our Facebook playlist, again, completely free of charge. Now, I keep saying that for the last few weeks, I've been saying, oh, there's some news coming, there's some news coming. Well, all I can say is tomorrow at 9 a.m, there'll be a little teaser going out. So do join us on Facebook tomorrow. Keep your eyes out on our social media tomorrow at 9 a.m, because there's going to be a little teaser. But there is a really exciting announcement coming within the next couple of weeks. So do keep a lookout for that. But if you're enjoying these lectures, please do consider supporting our work. As Shana said, we own and protect 356 historic churches across the country on behalf of nation, and behalf of future generations, so that they can continue to use, love, and admire these wonderful pieces of heritage. Now, there's a few ways that you can support our work. You can donate completely securely through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk. But you can also, if you've got your mobile phone with you, you can send a text donation. So if you text the word simply CCT to 70331, that will give us a gift of £3. There are some other codes that you can use. We'll post shortly other codes that you can use. But you could also join us as a member. Now, being a member is a fantastic way of supporting our work, but it's a fantastic way of also learning about our work, having a more deeper relationship with us and with our church buildings. So if you become a member, a membership starts from just £3.50 a month. So the price it's actually cheaper than a Grand Macchiato at a very well-known coffee chain store. But as I said, if you join us by direct debit from just £3.50 a month and use the offer code LECTURE, and that's lecture in capitals, you'll get a free copy of this wonderful book, which is Decoding the Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals. So that's a free membership gift if you join us by direct debit and use the offer code LECTURE. But there's quite a lot of benefits and rewards really for being a member with us. So you get a members magazine, Pinnacle, several times a year. The latest one has just been completed by one of my colleagues, and you'll shortly be receiving that if you're already a member. But you'll also hear about up-to-date conservation work. You'll get invites to exclusive events, but there's also another really exciting member benefit that will be announced very shortly. As all I can say is keep your eyes out on social media over the coming weeks, but do make sure from 9 AM tomorrow you look on our social media. But if you've got any questions, do let us know. If you've got any problems during the live stream and you can't get something to work, again, just comment away or send us a direct message, and either myself or one of my team will be on hand to help. I should also say that one of the best things about these lectures is that there is plenty of time at the end of our guests, once they've given their lecture, to ask them any questions you might have inspired by their talk. So if you're watching on Facebook, please do comment away using that Facebook chat feature, and we'll do our best to put your questions to our lecturer at the end of the talk. Well, I think that's enough from me today. So I'm going to pass you back to Shana, who's going to introduce today's guest lecture.
Thank you, George. And you're really teasing us with that announcement that we've got coming, so we're on tenterhooks here. So we're really happy and very pleased today to welcome Dr. Linda Parker. She's an independent scholar and author who has published mainly on 20th century military and religious topics, but also on polar exploration. She's interested in all modern history, is a member of the Western Front Association, Royal Historical Society, and a founder member of the British Modern Military Society. Linda enjoys travelling to conferences and talking about her books. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Dr. Linda Parker. Thank you.
Oh, right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me this afternoon to talk about my research on chaplains, and particularly Anglican chaplains in the Great War. I think it's very appropriate to be speaking about these men on Remembrance Day, because as many of them played a very large part to play in the ceremonies of remembrance that developed in the post-war years. So I thought I'd start with a picture of the chaplain who started off my interest in research in chaplains, and this is the Reverend William Drury. And this was about 15 years ago. He volunteered as a chaplain in 1915 and spent the war in Egypt and the Western Front and Mesopotamia. He wrote a book called Cap Follower. And my husband actually gave it to me for a Christmas present. And I read this book. I thought, oh, this is really good. He didn't become famous or receive any medals. He's a pretty typical chaplain. But as I read his story, I became fascinated by the different roles that chaplains had to fulfill. And after more investigation, I became aware that Anglican chaplains in particular had a rather bad press in the interwar years. Now, this didn't concur with what I'd read, so I decided to investigate further. And that was the start of the story. The Great War was to present the Army Chaplains Department with challenges and difficulties. At the outbreak of war on August 1914, the establishment strength of the department was only 117. They were from all denominations, but with the vast majority of them, 89, being Anglican. The department was to grow in strength until in 1918, there were 3,475 chaplains, nearly 2,000 of whom were Anglican. The administrative structure was minimal and certainly not up to the vast strains that the war would put upon it. So, I mean, who could have predicted in August 1914 the ways in which the number of army chaplains would grow and how their role would change as the war progressed? By November 1918, 166 chaplains died as a result of the war. 3 had won the Victoria Cross. Anglican chaplains alone earned 37 Distinguished Service Orders and 205 military crosses. On the 22nd of February 1919, the Army Chaplains Department received the accolade of becoming the Royal Army Chaplains Department in recognition of what the King described as the splendid work which has been performed by them. It would seem at the time that their efforts were very much appreciated. However, with other groups, such as the Generals and the Hague and the Lines led by donkeys, in the general disenchantment and iconoclasm of the 1920s and the 1930s, the Army chaplains came in for much criticism. Authors who had themselves been involved in the war, like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, and whose books became bestsellers, criticised the Anglican chaplains in particular for cowardice and incompetence. One Mr. C.R. Benstead was particularly scathing in this book, which is actually a novel, but paints the protagonist of the novel, which is a chaplain, in a very poor light. But it must be remembered that these books were part of the war boom books written in the late 20s and early 1930s, and they were actually meant to be sensational in order to make their authors money, some of whom in dire straits. Recent work on historians has including contemporary sources, first-hand account of chaplains and soldiers and generals, has done much to revise this view, and it rather tells a different story. The chaplains in the battlefields of the Great War had a large number of opportunities and tasks and difficulties to overcome. This is one of the most famous, Geoffrey Studdard Kennedy, or Woodbine Willie. And when he first went to France, he was asked the question in the trenches. He was going forward with a wiring party in quite a dangerous situation in the dark, up to his knees in water. And he was asked, excuse my language, what the bloody hell is the church doing here? Which caused him to reflect on the role he has undertaken. He said to himself, was he merely a stretcher bearer or merely an amateur undertaker? Roger Lloyd, a Church of England historian, has said of the chaplain situation, quote, he could indeed become necessary, but he must create that necessity himself. Different priests sought out their usefulness in different ways, some of them providing recreation and spiritual and physical sustenance away from the line, some seeing their place in or near the front line. And the story of the Army Chaplains Department in war is of seeking a role or roles that would succeed at bringing the reality of God into the lives of the soldiers that were engaged in total war. Now, what becomes clear is this is not a cohort of young, inexperienced priests who had not any of their ideas or preconceptions tested before going off to become chaplains. Even though they were quite young, they were not inexperienced. 25% of them had actually been in the living before going to the front. 30% had been missionary or in no parochial posts. These ranged from missionary work in the Solomon Islands, Hong Kong, Sudan. There were prison chaplains, headmasters, deans of Oxbridge colleges. Chaplains have been criticised for being almost exclusively from privileged society, with little experience of what we'd call real men. And indeed, many of them did come from privileged backgrounds and had an Oxford education. But when you consider that many of the curates went to war from large parishes such as Portsea, they had experience of, and working in settlements of the East End, they would have had a wide experience, I think, of men with all types, and the image of them as socially inept and inexperienced, bumbling chaplains, so beloved of literary post-war detractors, appears to start to look unlikely. Many of the problems faced by temporary chaplains were of an institutional manner. The army had made no material provision for temporary chaplains at all, and provided no training. King's regulations were very sparse in their advice. They simply required chaplains to conduct parade and voluntary services and to perform burials. So, amidst the confusion and recruitment, early deployment of temporary chaplains, the regular chaplains were embarked for France and involved in the retreat from Mons and the Battle of the Marne. This is the Reverend Douglas Winifred, an Anglican chaplain attached to the 14th Field Ambulance. And he was very aware that the action had started and he was keen to get on with things. He said, "We knew that the field ambulance would be needed and we were anxious to do our bit. At Honeggy, the role of the ambulance was to support the fighting that was going on at Le Cateau. The attitude of some officers to chaplains at this stage of the war is shown by a comment made to Winifred by an officer who said, 'Good morning, Padre. This is no place for you or the hospital. It'll be a warm spot.' But Winifred assured the officer that the Padre and the doctors were not going to desert them and were close at hand if needed." Winifred did indeed find himself fully occupied assisting in a farmhouse, which had been turned into a temporary ward, holding limbs where the doctor bandaged them and giving a word of prayer, he said, here and there. Winifred and his Methodist colleague, O.S. Watkins, worked closely together, especially in the clearing of battlefields and burying soldiers, and clearly marking the position of graves. Now, this is very important because this was invaluable information when the Commonwealth Graves Commission started its work, because the chaplains were the only people who had noted specifically in this early part of the war where people had been sort of randomly buried along the way before they were brought into main cemeteries. Oh, and this is Watkins and Winifred in a lighter-hearted moment on the retreat from Mons. He appears to be cutting his hair, I think. Okay, temporary chaplains, meanwhile, had been arriving in France, and they had a much more frustrating time. The mobilisation plans, as I said, didn't include plans for transporting, accommodating, paying, or even feeding the chaplains. There was also confusion about where the chaplain should actually be. The Reverend F.R. Barry described the situation. He said, "When the Padres first went out to the British Expeditionary Force, they had little to do with, they didn't know what to do with them. In battle, they were left behind at base and were not allowed to go up to the fighting front. However, the pressure had been rising within the Anglican clergy for restrictions on their movements to be lifted. As early as October 1914, the Reverend Neville Talbot was writing to his senior chaplain. There's much scope, he said, and work to be done with the unit as a whole and with fighting troops. One can know them, see them in the trenches, help them with their daily prayers, have services with them when they're in the billets, and be available for help in all ways." A letter from the Reverend Guy Rogers on December 1915 shows that not all chaplains obeyed these orders. He said, "I'm sure you've guessed that my work often takes me into the trenches. It is a tradition, it's expected, and what would influence largely depends, go in and out amongst the men where they are." Bishop Gwyn of Sudan, at first a humble chaplain 4th class, later Deputy Chaplain General, and some other bishops, also the Guardian newspaper, had been agitating for change. By the beginning of 1916, therefore, the Army Chaplains Department had overcome some severe ideological and practical problems relating to its deployment and was present everywhere and at battalion level, as well as being attached to a base hospital, headquarters and ambulances. Reverend G.A. Weston was the senior chaplain to the 18th Division in the months leading up to and during the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. In his divisional war diaries, he gives an illuminating account of the role of the senior chaplain. During the height of the Battle of the Somme, it was important that the chaplains continued their vital work of making accurate notes on burial sites. The chaplains attached to the division met regularly to discuss their work and to allocate their roles for battle situations. The meeting was held on the 14th of September, and part of the business of the meeting was to discuss the situation of the divisional chaplains in the coming battle. The meeting showed clearly the increasing care taken to ensure that chaplains were in the right place at the right time, and that there was a liaison of chaplains of different denominations. By the beginning of 1916, many of the difficulties experienced by the chaplains in the early days of the war were being resolved. The generals had a good opinion of their work and their effects on morale. When Archbishop Davidson went to France in May 1916, he actually pressed Haig for criticism to the chaplains, but reported, "I could elicit nothing but laudation." As a result of the more efficient administration of the department, there was now a much greater chance of a chaplain, as I said, being in the right place at the right time. The Chaplains Department now had a better infrastructure of support for its chaplains, and many individual chaplains were beginning to feel that their efforts were appreciated. As Harry Blackburn, Assistant Deputy Chaplain, 1st Army, put it, "There's a job all right for a padre out here." The acceptance by officers, men and chaplains themselves that their place was with the men in time of battle was encouraged by the words and actions of the Reverend Studid Kennedy. And here he is again. It was Studid Kennedy's belief that a padre should make a point of seeking out the dangerous spots in order to counteract the idea that being a chaplain was a soft job. Later, Drury encountered him at the chaplain school of instruction in St. Omer. He remembers, at St. Omer, he urged us chaplains to seek the most dangerous positions, as our presence was the best expression we could give of our message to the troops. Reverend E.C. Cross believed there was a growing practice of chaplains being closer to the men in time of battle, and that is a good effect on the morale of both chaplains and men, because they were not under orders to be there, and as such could hardly fail to encourage the rest, who had no option in the matter. The work of the chaplain near the front line consisted of helping at regimental aid posts, leading stretcher bearing parties, locating the dead, making a careful note of where they have fallen if it was not possible to bring them in. Cross places great importance on the work of the chaplains during and after the battle in discovering and identifying the dead, and therefore making the casualty lists more accurate. Much of the work done by the chaplains on the Western Front was concerned with the care of the wounded at base hospitals, ambulances and casualty clearing stations. When the chaplains first went out to France in 1914, they were often attached to field ambulances. Winifred was involved, as we've seen, in the retreat from Mons. But at this stage of the war, the field ambulance was never very far from the advancing German army. In fact, 2 chaplains were captured with their troops and ended up in POW camps. At the field ambulance in Drury in September, Winifred described the scene. At night, we were especially busy, the ambulance bringing in as many as 150 men. As they lay in the straw, I went around and did what I could, taking a message of one, a card for another, giving drinks of Bovril and helping some to move into a more comfortable position, saying a word to all and having prayers with the most serious cases. He expressed continually the sense of his work being a mix of the practical and the spiritual. Reverend Edmund Kennedy had strong views about the value of the presence of the padre amongst the severely wounded. He said, if a dying man is conscious and realised his position, then there will be the last messages for the loved ones at home, the setting right of some existing wrong. The work at dressing stations was indeed no cushy number. The Reverend Charles Downey, with the 18th Infantry Brigade near Ypres in October 1915, travelled up to the frontline trenches regularly. On the 13th of October, he hitched a lift with an officer from the 18th Field Ambulance to go to a regimental aid post to conduct a funeral. On the way, at the crossroads just outside Ypres, the vehicle came under shell fire and Downey was injured. The stomach wound proved fatal, and he died on the 16th of October, and he's buried at Lichtenhoek Cemetery. Many of the military crosses awarded to the chaplains in the war were for gallantry in the course of their practical efforts in bringing in the wounded and the spiritual care of the wounded in ambulances and hospitals. Although both contemporary and modern commentators have described the efforts, the worth of the chaplain being measured by seeing the scene being in the thick of action, much valuable work was being done by chaplains behind the lines at dressing stations and hospitals, which consisted of medical, social and spiritual work. But this did not preclude the opportunity of courage in battle situations being shown by the chaplains. Theodore Bailey Hardy, here he is, and this is a famous portrait of him, which is in the Army Chaplains Centre that used to be in Amport, but is now in Beckett House in Shrivenham. So yes, Theodore Bailey Hardy was one of the most famous of the Great War chaplains. He won the DSO, MEMC and a VC before being killed in October 1918. So keen was he being in the front line that when the relieving battalion came, he was just passed on, as he said, like the trench stores. He never actually left. And here he is being presented with his Victoria Cross by King George V. Another VC was won by Noel Mellish in March 1916 at Sir Delaware, and that was for bringing the wounded in under fire. and no, I've lost William. I've lost one. Sorry. There was a William Addison in Cut in 1916, and here we have the Reverend the Honourable Maurice Peel, MC and Bar, who was a real character. He believed in being in the very front line, often going over the top, armed with a Macintosh over his arm and a walking stick. He was killed at Bullecourt in 1917 because he insisted on crawling out onto the front lines on Ascension Day to pray over the people that were there that couldn't be brought in, and he was killed then. Now, one duty of a chaplain that seems sort of pretty obvious is that of taking services, but this proved to be the most frustrating as well as the most rewarding part of his job. Often the well-laid plans for services on a Sunday were disrupted by sudden changes of plan for troop movements. Neville Talbot described the difficulties as hens lying to lay eggs on moving staircases. The basic block of the religious service was the church parade. Controversy raged over its usefulness. The main objection from the ranks was the association of the parade service with a kit and uniform inspection, and the fact that attendance was compulsory. Julian Bickersteth, in July 1916, said, "I'm becoming less and less enamoured of compulsory church parades. I think we shall do far better as chaplains by insisting on voluntary service." But the church parade wasn't actually abolished until 1946, I think. So his words weren't heeded. Much more rewarding to the chaplains then were these voluntary services held after the parade and at various other times. They were considered to be of much more worth and significance than the parade services. Holy Communion or Holy Eucharist was seen as an essential part of the Padre's ministry. The personal memoirs of serving Anglican chaplains are peppered with accounts of preparing men for confirmation so that they could take part in the sacrament. Bishop Gwyn's wartime diaries show a considerable amount of his time was spent in touring the Western Front, confirming candidates that had been prepared by their brigade or divisional chaplains. Chaplains had to revise some of their long-held beliefs about the administration of communion. It was realised that tradition of fasting communion made little sense when services were often quickly arranged and had to fit in with army routine. Those who had previously objected to the use of the reserved sacrament realised its usefulness under battle conditions. Blackburn was in the lead of this more flexible attitude, cheerfully asserting, not long after he arrived in France, he said, "We have communion services at all times of the day and night. One has to change one's ideas out here." There are many mentions of Holy Communion and the satisfaction that chaplains felt in taking a well-attended communion service. At Talbot House, men and officers took communion in the beautiful and peaceful settings of the upper room. Now, this is a picture of the upper room. I expect some of you will have been to Poplar and Gate at Talbot House to see it. And if you do, the best time to go up into the upper room, up a little ladder, is first thing in the morning when the light is shining in through the windows. And it is a very marvellous experience. And is it St. Paul, I think, talks about the great cloud of witnesses? Well, if you go in that room in the quiet in the morning, you're indeed surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. On Easter Day here in 1916, there were 10 celebrations of Holy Communion from 5:30 a.m. because you couldn't get very many in at the time. Many of the men, freshly confirmed, actually made their first and their last communion in the upper room, going off and being killed shortly after having been confirmed and having communion. Chaplains on other fronts were facing problems. The Reverend Spooner in the Siege of Kut in Mesopotamia in the winter and spring of 1915-16 struggled to provide adequate services to the besieged troops under constant shelling and Turkish attack. Early in January 1916, he conducted a communion service in the trenches near Turkish lines. He said, "About 20 communicants, mostly officers. We sang 2 Christmas hymns. It seemed to mean a great deal to those men facing death daily, sometimes hourly." The chaplains made special efforts and took pride in providing services for the major religious festivals. Many chaplains' accounts of the war include detailed descriptions of the nature and the number of services attended on Christmas Day and Easter Sunday. On Christmas Day in Kut, the Reverend Spooner set out to the second line trenches to take a communion service, and he reported back, "What an extraordinary service. 18 officers and men in a dugout. a milk box for an altar, a flask for a chalice, an ordinary plate for a pattern, bullets whizzing overhead. We sang 2 hymns, while shepherds watched their flocks and harked the herald angels sing. Never have I heard such devout and earnest singing. Never have I seen a congregation so thoughtful and devout. The task of providing services for the troops throughout the war was one of high priority to the Chaplains Department. They may have failed sometimes in the scope and nature of services supplied, but the evidence in their writings show how remittingly they worked to provide these services in a variety of circumstances. Now, of course, one of the main services they had to do was taking funerals. And as the war went on, as trench warfare developed, burials became more rushed and dangerous affairs, often performed under fire. Studdard Kenny's written a lovely poem about a funeral performed under fire, but that's a whole other talk and a whole other lecture. Yes, so burials often took place under difficult circumstances. The Reverend Hood relates a funeral in the trenches of Gallipoli just as dawn was breaking. He said, "No light or book, so by heart I used what prayers seemed the most useful ending, and ending with the one that invites the whole church in paradise and on earth." One of the most frequent dilemmas of the chaplain of the Great War in the search for their appropriate role was one of their chief functions seemed to be suppliers of material wants and entertainment. Neville Talbot, senior chaplain, called this holy grocery, and the term has become synonymous with the idea that instead of concentrating on spiritual growth and revival in the trenches, the chaplains got diverted to becoming some kind of social worker, creating canteens and procuring cinema shows and concert parties. Even the nickname of one of the most famous, Woodbine Willie, is given the idea that the chaplains are suppliers of vast quantities of cigarettes and material comforts. A dilemma in which the chaplains found themselves as to the real nature of their ministry to the troops was one that did not escape them at the time. Contemporary accounts written by chaplains on active service are full of references to the situation in which they found themselves. They were often considered by company commanders to have plenty of spare time, which could be filled usefully by organising football matches, censoring letters, or setting up a canteen. However, the Reverend Horsley Smith said, "A chaplain's real work did not consist in giving out of cigarettes, nor even bringing in the wounded under fire, but in ministering the word and the sacraments, and often standing in the eyes of men as a link with home and other things which were of lovely and good report." The epitome of this necessity to meld spiritual with physical and material support was best perhaps found in the activities of the Reverend Philip Tubby Clayton at Talbot House in Popringay. Tubby had the gift of friendship to all types and conditions of men, and his gifts ranged from being an expert scrounger to a confidant and a counsellor. Talbot House was a rest centre, which became the famous haven in hell, through which so many men passed through for rest and recreation, and if they wanted, religion during the war. The house was run on strictly egalitarian lines. The prevailing ethos summed up in the notice above Tubby's study door: "All rank abandoned, you enter here." Officers were charged 5 francs for board and lodging, on the Robin Hood principle of taking from the rich to give to the poor, he said. Tubby summed up the purpose of the house. Its whole raison d'etre was always to be an Emmaus Inn, a home from home where friendships could be consecrated, sad hearts renewed and cheered, a place of light and joy and brotherhood and peace. Many soldiers made their way up to the beautiful chapel and loft, as we said, and some have made their first and last communion there. And I think of all the Anglican chaplains in the First World War that I have spoken about, written about and talked about, he remains my favourite. I'm a trustee of Tockage at the moment, and Tubby and Tockage are very important to me. Stuart Kennedy captured the uncertainty but resolution present in the chaplain's role in his famous encounter with the Reverend Theodore Bailey Hardy. He said, Bailey Hardy, asked me about purely spiritual works. I said, there is very little. It is all muddled and mixed. Take a box of fags in your haversack and a great deal of love in your heart and go up with them. You can pray with them sometimes, but pray for them always. The chaplain's dilemma in terms of the rights and wrongs of Holy Grocery is still present both in the army and in the parish, because there will always be discussions about the pros and cons of spiritual or active pastoral care. The Scottish padre Lachlan Watts seems to sum up that dilemma. He said, "A chaplain's life is not, as so many think, a thing of services. It is rather a thing of service." There is no doubt that the highest commanders in the British Army were genuinely and seriously religious, and this piety influenced their conduct in running the war. General Haig was a devout Presbyterian and was influenced in his opinion of the worth of chaplains by his personal chaplain, the Reverend G.S. Duncan. Haig often visited the Army Chaplains School at St. Omer, which was called the Chaplains Bombing School, because the infantry used to go off to bombing schools and chaplains used to go off to St. Omer. Go back to Haig, he kept in close touch with Bishop Gwynn, who ran it. Haig told Gwynn that his job was the most important under his command. Bishop Gwynn in his diaries frequently recounts occasions when army generals addressed a group of chaplains at the school. It would seem that there was a strong mutual regard and cooperation between senior commanders of the army and the Army Chaplains Department that helped them work well together. This relationship has been the source of yet more criticism of the army chaplain in the First World War. This criticism asserts that the chaplains were used by high command as morale boosters of a very important kind, and that they showed signs of bellicosity in boosting this morale that was wholly inappropriate for their calling. The accusation is that in their most spiritual and pastoral roles, they encouraged a fighting spirit of the troops by sermons and talks, and that their contribution to raising morale became the chief value in the eyes of the generals. The relaxation of that order forbidding chaplains from the front was the result of a growing realization by these commanders that the chaplains could be useful morale boosters in a military sense as well as a material one. And I think it was the realization of the chaplain's potential use, whether that was a right use or not, was a major reason for the relaxation of restrictions. Although the close cooperation between army commanders and army chaplains has been criticised in terms of the chaplain's role in the war, it cannot be denied that the generals were motivated by religious feeling as well as military considerations. Because, of course, the attributes required from men fighting a war, such as that in the trenches of the First World War, after all, are in some ways the same as living a religious life, trusting in God, self-sacrifice, selflessness, a sense of giving oneself for a higher cause. A continual preoccupation of army chaplains at the front was the question of whether the war had caused any kind of religious revival, and to what extent were soldiers religious. There were conflicting opinions on the way in which the war had changed soldiers. A chaplain in the Scottish regiment found that a great many men have a sense of God's presence with them and pray to him with a firm belief that he is concerned with individuals' lives and able to protect. However, he goes on to say that a very large number of men have found new difficulties for faith as a result of the war. With some, it has resulted in complete loss of faith in a personal God. Neville Talbot blamed the absence of a religious revival both on the nature of total war and the lack of spiritual equipment and education to deal with it. What chaplains such as Neville Talbot and committed laymen such as Donald Hackey knew that the religion, where it existed, was often inarticulate. It was God-centred, but not specifically Christian. It has been described as a kind of diffusive Christianity. By 1918, the chaplains of the Western Front were present in all places in battle. Brigade chaplains in particular being encouraged to be near their men in the front line. And between January 1918 and November 19, they suffered 50 fatal casualties of chaplains. This was actually 33% of the deaths of the army chaplains in the whole war, which was 166. 27 of these deaths were in the last 100 days, August and November. An examination of some of the deaths of chaplains in that time shed lights on their roles. Most of these were recorded as killed in action or died of wounds, although some were from illness, especially those who recorded after the end of the war, possibly through influenza. So, by what criteria are these Anglican chaplains to find a role for themselves to be judged? Their success in fulfilling of material needs, their success in providing adequate religious services, their work with hospitals or ambulances, being in the front line of battle, With hindsight, it's easy to separate the multifarious tasks that were the lot of the wartime chaplain. But to him, I think they were all a woven piece. Providing physical and material help was not separated in the chaplain's mind from providing spiritual comfort in services and pastoral visits to the trenches. A chaplain's job was to minister to the men in the army in whatever way he could, regardless of the distinctions that we may today impose on these different functions. If Jesus could heal the sick and provide food for 5,000, as well as proclaiming God's kingdom, then surely that was their job also. The Anglican chaplains that returned from the war were to bring their experiences to bear in the life of the church and the country. Stuart Kennedy became the main missioner of the Industrial Christian Fellowship. Many achieved positions of authority and influence as bishops and deans and members of convocation. Some became eminent theologians. Tubby Clayton formed TOC H, but most went back to their parishes and put into practice the lessons learnt from war of how to relate to all types and conditions of men and women. Many changed the way they took and preached services. Some got involved in local and national politics. Some took the lead in rituals remembrance. Many of them, luckily, wrote about how the war had changed them. But the way that they were changed and they changed society, I'm afraid, is another story and perhaps another lecture. So on Remembrance Day, back briefly to remembrance. After the war, Tubby formed the TOC H movement, which he felt would be a living memorial to the men who had died in the war. And TOC H has always been very much based with remembrance of what we call the elder brethren, as well as very much concerned with today's problems. This Sunday, TOC H members will march as usual in the remembrance ceremony at the cenotaph. I've got the wreath ready. Because TOC H is one of the civilian organisations who were invited to march as a mark of the work they've done for the armed forces in the 20th century. The most well-known example of how a former First World chaplain had an effect on national remembrance of the war was the role played by David Railton, chaplain in France from 1916 to 1918, in the train of events leading to the unknown warrior being brought to his resting place in Westminster Abbey in November 1921. Railton, who won the Military Cross and was mentioned in dispatches, was moved particularly by the grave of a soldier bearing the inscription "An Unknown Soldier" on the Somme in 1916. The idea that came to him was let this body, this symbol of him, be carried reverently across the sea to his native land. And this has grown in his mind until August 1920, when he wrote to the Dean of Westminster, Hubert Ryle. He examined this idea of a burial of an unknown soldier in the Abbey and offered his flag for use in the service. Ryle was enthusiastic about the idea and pressed for it as his own. Despite some initial doubts from the King, Lloyd George, being aware of the overwhelming reaction to the temporary cenotaph in the Victory Parade in August 1919 and on Armistice Sunday, November 1919, saw this as an opportunity for a focus for public mourning and a possible distraction from post-war political agitation. The tomb did have a great resonance with the British public, and thousands filed past to pay their respects in the 7 days that the grave was left open. On the first day alone, 40,000 mourners passed the tomb. Every bereaved person and family now had a grave to represent their missing son or husband, and everyone could think that their missing son or husband was in that grave. Railton's experiences in the war had brought home to him the needs of the families of the missing, and those buried abroad. They needed to have a national symbol of remembrance, grief and mourning. But in the midst of war, he had also been thinking of the remembrance involved in practical action. On the 9th of January 1917, he wrote, "If God spares me, I shall spend half my life getting the rights for the men who fought out here." This is the slide of an unknown chaplain, who was one of the first chaplain pictures that I got. I've never been able to find anything about him. He's got a wound stripe. But in a way, it's quite nice, I think, that he's anonymous. He sits on the wall halfway up our stairs. So I want to put him up as the last slide. So at the beginning of the war, chaplains did not clearly have a defined role in the new concepts of mass trench warfare. But in the same way as the commanders of the army had to learn about total warfare and trench warfare, so did the chaplains. Each chaplain had to define his own role in the job, depending on his individual skills and circumstances. Some concentrated on havens of material and spiritual comfort as Talbot House. Some found their niche in base hospitals and some in frontline trenches. Some ministered to material needs, some to the spiritual, most to both. They were simply men of God in the maelstrom of war, endeavouring to bring God to the lives of men in the trenches in whatever way they could, and they should be remembered as such. Thank you. Hello, are you back?
Thanks so much, Linda. That was a fascinating lecture there. And everyone, I'm just going to leave Linda's slide on so you can see some of the books that Linda has authored there. And as she said, if you'd like to get in contact with Linda, her details are on the screen there. Linda, I'm just going to stop your screen sharing.
Oh, yeah.
Second, and we will shortly be going into question time. So everyone, now's your opportunity to ask Linda any questions that you have. So I see there's been some really interesting questions coming in already. Linda, I thought it was really interesting how you talked about Stuart Kennedy, because like you, he is a bit of a hero for me. I'm sorry about the dogs, everyone, they're playing at the moment. Right, go over there. I think it was quite interesting because often you talked about some came back, some became bishops, some went back to parish ministry. I think Stuart Kennedy is quite an interesting story because in some ways the war really had a huge impact on his life. He died quite young. But also, I don't know if you want to touch on it, but yeah, even when he died, there were people in the church who didn't like his politics. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Right, well, I could probably give you an hour on Stuart Kennedy, but very briefly, yes. When he came back, he gave up his job in his parish after a year because he had too many public speaking engagements. He was quite famous by then. He'd written books of poetry, he'd written another book in the war, and eventually he went to be the missioner of the Industrial Christian Fellowship, which still exists today. And he spent the rest of his quite short life trying to reconcile business with religion, and he was quite left-wing in his views, and he's quite outspoken. So that's why I believe he didn't have a funeral. One of the reasons why he didn't have a funeral in Westminster Abbey. But I think he would have preferred to be done in Worcester, and his funeral in Worcester, I wasn't there, by all accounts, was a truly magnificent occasion. But yes, he continued to write poetry, some of it really deeply moving poetry. He wrote novels. He touched on things that other people didn't talk about, like divorce and contraception and things like that. He had an amazing life, but he died in 1929. I've written a book about him if you want to read it.
Thanks, Linda. And I think he is quite an unsung. He is well known. He's probably one of the most famous of the.
Yeah, but I don't think people know. Know an awful lot about his life after the war. Yeah.
I'm quite one of the he was a poet, as Lynn said, but one of the poems to go and look at, everyone, is written in the 1920s. It's called Indifference. And later on, another hero of mine, but from across the pond in the Roman Catholic Church, is Fulton Sheen. And Fulton Sheen quotes Stuart Kennedy when talking about society and the role of indifference in our lives. But everyone, we're going to go into some questions. So there's been more coming in. So the first one I want to kind of dive into with you, Linda, is was there opposition about chaplains going to the Western Front, as it was considered at first that they may have been needed at the home front to support the keep up moral support for congregations back home?
Yeah, there's a sort of quite a lot of controversy at the time. A lot of ordinands went before they were ordained. And the bishops were encouraging them younger chaplains to go to the front. But on the other hand, as you said, there's those that had a parish, like Stuart Kennedy, had to wait a year before he went because he was in a parish, and he was the incumbent of the parish, and he had to make arrangements for the parish while he was away. And so yes, there was quite a lot of, and of course quite a few, not a lot, but quite a few parish priests didn't want to go anyway, because they were, of a pacifist inclination, and even more weren't accepted by the Army Chaplains Department because they didn't want to take them all at the same time, and they just went off and enlisted as private soldiers. particularly some of the non-conformists went as private soldiers, and then once they were in the trenches and they were actually doing chaplains' work, they were then made up to be chaplains. But does that answer the question?
I think it does, and I think you touched on there that you mentioned about non-conformists, but if someone was a Roman Catholic or if someone was from a different faith, were they able to join the Royal Army, or it was the Army Chaplain Division then, but were they able to be chaplains as well?
Yeah, you had Roman Catholics, you had the United, the United Reform Church, the Methodists and the United Reform were in something, I can't remember now the name of it, but you had Catholics. You had some Jewish chaplains, only a few of them, but they seemed to zoom around the Western Front incredibly swiftly. At that time, of course, you didn't have chaplains of other faiths. That's different. I could go on about that as well. But it was nearly, I would say that it was a majority were Anglicans, but there were certainly Methodists, two types of Methodists, United Reform. Scottish Presbyterians were very strong in the chaplain front. There were quite a few Scottish Presbyterians.
And I really like the question that I'm just going to ask now. And I just want to say, someone said, did other armies, and I'm just going to quote what they said, I hesitate to say enemies or Germans, and I support that. I wouldn't use that term either. Did they have army chaplains similar to the British?
Yeah, indeed. They had German army chaplains, and a lot of on the belt of German soldiers it said "Gott mit uns," which is God with us. So God had split himself up very equally, I think. Yes, the Germans certainly did have chaplains, and there's someone called Patrick Porter, I think, who's done quite a lot of work on the similarities between their roles. But I must admit not knowing a huge amount about what German chaplains got up to, but they were definitely there.
And in terms of orders and sort of how they were commanded on the front, did they operate on their own, or did they have to take directives from the military generals and commanders in command?
I think they played it both ways, really. I mean, they're under the command of the chaplain general and the deputy chaplain general. But of course, if they had arranged a service and the commander comes along and says, "Sorry, Padre, cancel your service, we're off," then they would have to fit in with the local arrangements of the regiment. But as far as sort of religious things, and as far as the role of their work and appointments and promotions and things like that, it was the chaplain general and the deputy chaplain general that they were directly answerable to.
And you mentioned about certainly when burials were taking place, it was sort of thanks to the chaplains keeping records. After the war, was the work that the chaplains did continue sort of needed again to help identify lost graves, or did they sort of that kind of work?
I think it was what was the forerunner of the Commonwealth War Graves? Was it called the War Graves Commission? Anyway, before the War Graves, before the proper War Graves came in, they started quite early doing collecting graves and things like that. And I think it was at that stage that it was most useful. But of course, afterwards, for years afterwards, they've still been identifying unknown soldiers, haven't we? So it's very possible, I think, that the notes that the chaplains made at that time were useful for some time. Yeah, but it was just in the beginning of the war that they that this was such a vital thing, because especially on the retreat from Mons, people were just buried in orchards randomly, and there was the chaplains that actually knew later where to go and get them to, no, congregate isn't the word, concentrate them, that's the word, very go into big cemeteries, yeah.
And what was the role? Because it was quite interesting. There's people I can think of, like who bishops back home, so people like Charles Gore, who really encouraged people, not only naval and army chaplains, to get people to the front, but obviously he was founder of Murfields, and there was the Murfields hymn book over there. But what kind of support was there for army chaplains going to the front from parish clergy who stayed back home? Was there a link still, or a relationship between the two organisations?
Yes, I'm thinking there was, because they'd obviously want to know how their parishes were getting on. And sorry, I forgot the first part of your question now. I was just at a sudden blank moment. Just rewind a little minute.
Yeah, it was just asking if there had been sort of a link and sort of communication that sort of went between bishops back home and parishes.
Yes, bishops were very supportive. I mean, several of them went over. There's that Bishop Winnington Ingram, who was known as the recruiting bishop, much maligned man. He wasn't as bad as people say at all. But he went over to visit. Bishop Gwynn went over. Archbishop Davison went over. They were always popping over to the Western Front and saying, "Well done, chaps," you know. Yeah. Sorry, I just couldn't remember what it said. It's getting to me, you know, all this pressure.
No worries at all, Linda. Thank you for that answer there. For people wanting to research, and I did some research a few years ago when I worked at Ely into Army chaplains. There was in Ely, there used to be a theological college there, and I'm thinking of a gentleman there, Rupert Inglis, who wrote some amazing letters when he was back there. And when researching him, I had to go down to the Army Chaplaincy Museum, and they've got records of all the interviews. And I wonder if you could just touch on what happened, because it wasn't just that someone had to sign up to become a chaplain. They actually had to be interviewed for it, didn't they?
Yeah, they had to go and be interviewed by, and now the deputy chaplain then, whose name will come back to me in a minute, probably a few senior moments here, I think, but they had to go, and he was quite an evangelical chaplain. And he sometimes didn't like the Anglo-Catholic elements, but I mean, I think that worked its way through eventually, and there was a sort of equal representation. But they went and they had this interview, and I think you've seen the cards, haven't you? Some of them, you know, and they say things like, you know, a weak-looking man, and they'd say, yeah, oh, this one has a good sense of humour, you know. But I get the feeling that whatever they thought of them, very few of them were actually rejected out of hand. And of course, some of them were no good at all. And when they got there, only a few, but when they got there, there were cases of chaplains breaking down or being ill or just not up to it, and they were removed to the back, you know, the base hospitals or sent home. Actually, I think 1 or 2 chaplains were sent home because they actually took over commands in a serious situation. And some didn't get caught, but some did, and some were said, "Right, off you go, mate, you're not supposed to be doing that."
Just to back up, the cards are brilliant. I remember what you said, that the evangelical, the Bishop of London at the time, wrote on a couple of cards, if they were too high church for him, there was a particular card I remember looking at, and he went far too high church. He wrote it. Furiously wrong, too high church. Linda, I think another question to touch on is often, sometimes I know in some of our churches, you can
Taylor Smith, sorry, that's his name, Taylor Smith. Sorry, go on, carry on.
I'm thinking in some of our churches and some other churches that you go back to looking, you can often find trench art and often bullets and shells from artillery forged into crosses or other religious symbols. Yeah. Did the chaplains have a role in creating trench art? Were they used for services on the front, you know?
I wouldn't have thought they'd have much time, really. And I mean, I may be completely wrong with this, please pick me up on this, anyone, but I've heard that an awful lot of trench art wasn't actually made in the trenches, if you see what I mean. There was sort of material brought back. But certainly, what did happen was that the troops built sort of makeshift chapels for them and rigged up altars and made little wooden crosses to be used. You know, the religious troops were very keen to wherever they went so that they could set it up. Because they weren't allowed to go into the Roman Catholic churches. They were in the villages that they were near, many of which were bombed, you know, were sort of shelled anyway. But yes, I've never come across a chaplain related to a trench art, but who knows? There may well be.
And everyone will know there was that famous advert a few years ago created by Sainsbury's where they commemorated the Christmas Day truce. And what role was there, if any, or between chaplains on the different sides? Was there cross dialogue, and were they trying to create peace and a lasting peace between the different nations at war?
I have no idea. I've never come across in all my sort of writing, in also my looking at diaries and first-hand accounts of this happening. But what I do know is that before the war, the German churches and the British churches were very close, and that continued, that some kind of dialogue continued through the Swedes, more or less all the way through the war. But as to, it'd be a lovely idea, wouldn't it? You know, to think of a British chaplain popping out of the trench and say, "Hello, you know, you're the chaplain from, the Saxon division." But I haven't heard of it. If anyone else has, I'd be delighted to know.
Thank you, Linda. Well, everyone, thank you so much for your questions there. And again, thank you so much, Linda, for your time today for today's lecture. Everyone, if today was your first time joining us, please do let us know. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture today and have learned a lot. I know I've certainly learned quite a lot. So thank you once again, Linda, for your time with us today.
So well, thank you for having me.
Oh,
I'm glad my dog didn't bark. Your dog's a lovely.
Yeah, one's just woken up. So everyone, as we said at the start, if you've enjoyed these lectures, please do consider supporting our work. We own 356 historic churches across the nation, and we've got a couple more coming to us this year. And it's really important that people support our work in helping us to conserve and protect them. Now, you can join us as a member, as I said at the start, from just £3.50 a month. And if you join us by direct debit and use the offer code lecture, and that's the word lecture in capitals at checkout, you'll get a free copy of this book by Dr. Richard Dent, who was coming to us in December to do a follow-up lecture from the talk he did earlier this year. But it's a really phenomenal book covering lots of things to do with churches and cathedrals. Also, if you become a member of us, I should have said at the start, we do a series of monthly lectures just for our members. And this week we had probably my favourite member exclusive lecture so far, which was Professor Maya Stanfield-Marzi, who is from the University of Florida, who took us over to Latin America, where we looked at the role of in the indigenous nations and how they influence Roman Catholic liturgical fabrics and textiles. And it was a fantastic lecture. If you missed it, you can catch it up on our member playlist. But we've got some great member lectures coming up. Next Thursday, however, we are going to be joined by Dr. Ross King, who has written extensively about art and architecture. Now, he's going to be talking to us next week about Brunelleschi's Dome, the crowning glory of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. So do join us at the same time next week for that lecture. I should say you will be able to buy this book on our website, as well as his brand new book, The Bookseller of Florence, as well. So keep an eye out on our website if you'd like to get copies of those. As always, if you've got ideas for future lunchtime lectures, please do feel free to comment away, send us a direct message, or you can email me at digital@thecct.org.uk. I'm busy booking in lecturers for next year. I'm coming up towards Easter now in terms of booking, so do let us know what you'd like us to get lectures planned in for next year. But I can say that all of our lectures, our lunchtime ones, will remain free of charge. So no worries about that, but I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture. And as I said at the start of the lecture, keep your eyes peeled on Facebook tomorrow from around 9 AM for a little teaser for what's to come. But thank you ever so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it. And once again, thank you so much to Linda.
Thank you.